Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and I'm in the land where I was born. So I'm on Croppies Acre in Dublin. In case you don't know this imperial system of measurements, an acre is about half a hectare. So this is right beside Collins Barracks. It used to be called Royal Barracks until about 1922, and there it is behind me. So it was an army barracks. It's now a museum dedicated to the Irish separatist conflict going back to the 18th century. Anyway, in 1798 there was a rebellion here in Ireland. There was a shadowy organisation called the United Irishmen, and they were pledged to dissolve the Kingdom of Ireland, to sever our link with Great Britain, and to make Ireland a totally separate republic, separate from Great Britain, to bring about equality, as in no more religious tests. A test in those days didn't mean an exam as such. It meant oaths which were designed to be abhorrent to the Catholic majority, and sometimes even to Protestants outside the Church of Ireland, Presbyterians and so forth. Because the Anglican minority, at most 20% of the population, they were privileged, and not in this bogus sense that there's white privilege. They were legally privileged. It was absolutely crystal clear. And there were landlords, almost all of them Anglican, who lorded over everybody else, had a very good life, and most people were courtiers. Now, the thing is, that was the case in every country, that the baronial class were very privileged. However, in most countries, of course, the baronial class were the same religious denomination as most people. Not so in Ireland. Anyway, so the United Irishmen, they were mostly bourgeois intellectuals from Dublin, sometimes from Belfast. They were, despite being against Anglican domination, often were Anglican, sometimes Presbyterian, only a few of them were Catholics. So people who were politically conscious was mostly Anglophone people on the East Coast, and that mostly meant Protestant. So the rest of us, Hibernophone people, Catholics in the rest of the country, were not politically literate, I could say, or even literate at all. Okay, so there was a lot of illiteracy here in Ireland, just like the rest of the world. And most schools were run by the Church of Ireland. The only university, Trinity, was run by the Church of Ireland. So there were not many Catholic schools. Often we were going to hedge schools because they met outside, taught very informally, and couldn't have a fantastic education. So that June 1798, the rebellion broke out with the aid of France, because remember, the United Kingdom was at war against France, and King George III was King of Ireland as well as King of Great Britain. So France had its own revolution a few years earlier, had become a republic and all that, had proclaimed the rights of man and of citizen. So there's no doubt that France was ahead of the rest of the world politically. They briefly experimented with democracy, giving the vote to all men and indeed to women. Very briefly took it away from them. They outlawed slavery in their Caribbean colonies, which was fantastic. The French was soon to pedal back on all of this, and Napoleon soon came in as a Caesar figure. At this time he was invading Egypt, supposedly to liberate it from the Ottoman Empire, which is an ally of the British, but really it was just a French aggrandizement. They'd annexed a lot of northern Italy. Okay, they'd set up the Cisalpine Republic and so on, but whatever the ideological guise, it was mainly French expansionism. So I suppose it should have allowed us to smell a rat, to realise that the French people didn't care a fig whether there was liberty in Ireland or not. But anyway, June 1798, the rebellion started prematurely. Stagecoaches, as in horse-drawn carriages to Dublin, were stopped because obviously that was carrying government mail, and some of the occupants of the coaches were killed by the roadside, even though they had nothing to do with the government. And there was a jacquerie down in Wexford. This is largely small farmers rebelling against the government, but the Loyalists fought back. Loyalist doesn't necessarily mean Protestant. There were plenty Castle Catholics, however you want to accentuate it, fighting for the crown. There was a sectarian element to the rebellion, and some Protestants were killed for their religious denomination in Wexford. Likewise, there was a rising in County Down. There's a Wexford rising which is mainly Catholic, but there were some Protestants in it, including some prominent ones. And there was a mostly Presbyterian rising in the north, but the government spread the word that this is a popish plot, the rising, which was largely bogus. There was a tiny bit of fighting in Cork. So in Ireland we didn't have an army as such. The British army was here. We had militia, and these were part-time soldiers. They did whatever job they did usually, and then 1 or 2 days a week would do military training. They had to provide their own uniform muskets. They had to be reasonably well off, so quite middle class. But also yeomanry, and a yeoman used to mean someone who owned a horse, and to own any kind of a horse made someone fairly wealthy. So a yeoman, same idea as a militia, but they were cavalry. So they were part-time soldiers, volunteers, organised on a county basis. So they were fighting for the crown to suppress the revolt. I won't go into the particulars, but anyway, it was put down. The United Irishmen they did enjoy some success in Wexford, but some of the militia, the yeomanry, some of the British Army here killed civilians, and it so horrified Father Murphy in Wexford, who'd initially counselled people to stand aloof from the conflict, that he said, well, I'm just obliged to defend my people, and he led the rebels into combat. However, he was defeated and put to death. There's that song about him, Boule Vogue, which is near where he's from. At Boule Vogue, a rebel had and set the heather blazing, and the song also says, God grant you glory, brave Father Murphy. So then in loyalist imagining, this became retold as a Catholic conspiracy led by priests, which is largely bogus. So let's not forget that the Archbishop of Dublin, he issued statements saying that the rebellion was irreligious and people must oppose it. And people say, oh, Presbyterians are involved as well. Yes, that is true. However, the Presbyterian synod censured the rising as well. So the rising was not coordinated. They were quite worried about being penetrated by government spies. And indeed, the Crown did have a number of informers, which is partly why it went off half-cocked early before French help had arrived. Then in August, French assistance did arrive on the west coast. Westport, the Battle of Castlebar. The Crown forces ran away so fast. They took all of the Castlebar races, and the rebels there, they got to Ballinamuck in the middle of Ireland, which is where they're defeated. But the French had printed proclamations saying that Ireland was going to be a democratic republic. And it was astonishing to use the word democratic because the word and the notion of democracy was all but forgotten. The French had only just brought it back. Okay, a lot of people couldn't read. In the west of Ireland, a lot of people couldn't speak English. And notably, they did not print the proclamation in Irish, which might have made more sense to at least read it aloud to people. This idea that everyone gets to go to school is actually very much a 20th century one. In the 18th century, we must remember that most people in most countries did not go to school for a single day. Anyhow, so a lot of the rebels were brought here because near the barracks, known as Croppies, because they cut their hair very short. And often they were carrying barley to eat. Croppies, Acre, and many people were summarily executed here. They were rebelled against the crown, especially in time of war, seen as traitors, and that was that. So it was very rough justice indeed. Some people imprisoned. I don't know if anyone were transported to Australia, actually. There wasn't much transportation going on to Australia. That'd only been going on for about 10 years at that stage. Moreover, the Royal Navy was busy fighting the French Navy, so there weren't many ships to spare, sending people all the way to Australia. I'll give you an example of just how savage justice was. In England at this time, a teenage mother who was penniless, she attempted to steal some linen, presumably to raise money to feed her baby. And the shopkeeper saw her, so the woman put it back. Nevertheless, that girl was found guilty of grand larceny and hanged. Life was cheap. To be precise, 5 shillings. People could be put to death for stealing 5 shillings. So where the Croppies died, their graves, they often had barley in their pockets when they were buried, and barley grew out of it that autumn. There's a Seamus Heaney poem about it. In case you don't know who Seamus Heaney was, well, he went to the great big Symposium of the Sky just a few years ago. He's a poet from Derry, and he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He said he was a nationalist, the passport's green. He wrote exclusively in English, and what else about him? But he eschewed Republican violence. But here is his poem about the Croppies. I shan't read it. So when I first came to Dublin as an adult, that's 20 years ago, Croppies Acre, well, there was something here, but there wasn't all this memorial. And of course it was the bicentenary, the 1798 Rising, which had just been defeated. It was a very optimistic time. The Good Friday Agreement had just been signed. Bertie Ahern and his Fianna Fáil government were in power. The economy was booming. So things were going our way. And here they've got some of the inscription in French, because the French army was here to help us. People often speculate if the French army had come here rather than invading Egypt, perhaps they would have succeeded. Would we have been better off if it had worked? We might have been. Obviously, this is imponderable, it's difficult to say. We would have been a satellite of France, because France annexed many other countries. Napoleon made himself first consul after this, then emperor, and he liked to put his siblings on the thrones of Europe, to marry his sisters to kings and princes. and have to be allied to France, go to war on the French behalf whenever. So in that sense we would not have been sovereign, but we still might have been better off. The Napoleonic Code, if they got rid of religious discrimination, that would have been good. Obviously I don't want any religious discrimination, but that was just a fact of life in every country in the 18th century. The majority being discriminated against is worse than the minority. If it was clear that the Republic was going to succeed, or the French were going to succeed and would become a kingdom under the thumb of France, then a lot of the establishment would have changed sides because they didn't want their property confiscated. So that is the 1798 Rising, a turning point in Irish history where history failed to turn. And would I have been in favour at the time, if I was around at the time? Just possibly, I don't know. It's not the same situation right now. Obviously, it was nowhere in the world was democratic at the time. As I say, the French were pretty soon rowing back on it, and Napoleon brought in these completely bogus referenda where he awarded himself millions of votes on the basis that every soldier would vote for him and things like that. We had parliamentary government here, but that was only giving the right to vote to the very wealthy, so it's very unrepresentative. So yeah, despite the terror in France of the guillotinings, that was probably a better system than what pertained in Ireland at the time. So I try to be a little bit detached about it and not to be so certain about it or too evangelical as some people are, because it's just frighteningly simplistic for some people. One side is good and the other side is evil, and I don't think it's quite so clear cut. Right, I'll switch it off now.